Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio no pictures live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast as you're driving along in your car or your truck or going along in public transport. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the many media articles that from online media and mainstream media talking about low birth rates equate to or tantamount to impending civilizational and societal collapse. Now, I'm going to be contrarian here. I don't agree with that. So my feeling is that I'm just going to look up something here actually while I'm online. My feeling is that it's not going to have that effect at all. Now, this idea of low birth rates means civilizational collapse, I think, are the same conceptual and logical mathematics that Thomas Malthus, the famous Parson Malthus, had in his Malthusian view that population, as it increases geometrically, 2, 4, 8, 16, is going to outstrip food production, which is arithmetic 1, 2, 3, 4. So now Malthus, Parson Thomas Malthus, his if you like, his calculations were quite correct at the time that he was putting that thesis together, and he was no moron. He's putting it together. And I'll simplify the numbers here to illustrate the point. An acre of land could produce, one cartload of wheat. So 1 acre of land equals 1 cartload of wheat. Or you can have, one milk cow can live on an acre of grassland and so on. Now, this was looking at that sort of calculus. Malthus quite reasonably said, well, if that's the production capacity of land, and this is the amount of land under production and so on, then population increase. And so he was predicting by, the early 1800s that population increase would be such that there'd be widespread starvation from too many people and not enough food. And again, it wasn't an out of place calculus. The numbers were reasonable. You look at it now and look at his thinking and his, but that was his thinking then, and technology changed. For example, much more land came under cultivation because of superior and better methods of drainage and swamp drainage, and the idea of during certain seasons of the year, vast areas of farmland were effectively became swamps as rivers overflowed, but again with proper land management and drainage, many hundreds of thousands of acres of land were turned to farmland. Then with proper crop rotation methods, better designs of plows and better technology, fertilizers, rotating land and fallow land, this sort of stuff, because of all these food production. So instead of one cart of wheat for an acre of land, production increased to 50 carts of wheat for 1 acre of land due to all this changing technology and more land under cultivation. So this starvation thing that Malthus calculated just never took place because there's so many other changes at so many other levels, technological, chemical, organizational, equipment design, and so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean, given the technology and attitudes and situation at the time, that Malthus's calculations were incorrect. They weren't. They were correct given. So I see this talk about population, civilizational collapse, and birth rates. I see that as stuck in the same conceptual mathematical mindset that Malthus had in the late 1700s and early 1800s in Britain. Now, let's have a look at declining birth rates. The big argument, or I suppose the primary arguments for declining birth rates equaling population decline and thus civilizational collapse is that there won't be enough taxpayers to pay for the social welfare to look after the old people, the retirees. And when the retirees reach a certain number, as opposed to workers, the ratio of workers, then at that point we can't look after the retirees, and that would be tantamount to, or an element of, civilizational collapse. So that's one. The second thing is or one of the next on the list is that, well, if the number of citizens or resident people are declining, then that means that there won't be enough workers to do the work. Who's going to do the work? Everything will collapse because there'll be no one to switch on the lights. There'll be no one to, do the sewerage or make sure that the water's coming in, or to fix anything. And they seem to jump, these prognosticators seem to jump from the idea of there may not be quite enough people, that there'll be nobody to do the work. No one, not a single worker. It'll go from not, just maybe not quite enough workers to zero workers. And of course that's quite absurd. And also the assumption is there that there'll be an ever increasing amount of jobs to be done. Now, if populations are declining, then fewer workers will be needed because there are fewer people to be fed, or to be looked after, or to be catered for, which would require fewer services because there are fewer customers and so on. So there would be a natural decline in the amount of people needed if indeed the population did decline. So the idea that there'd be an insufficient tax base, or the insufficient number of workers, insufficient number of people to look after the old, and so on, then I don't sort of see it that way. I don't know how people come. I can see the point behind it, but I think it's unrealistic and quite misplaced. Now, the other thing is, or the third thing is, that only a increasing number of, and a growing mass of consumers can ensure prosperity. And without that, there's no prosperity. So again, they play the binary game of there's either absolute prosperity or zero prosperity, nothing in between. It's one or the other, and which, of course, is again quite an absurd position to take. Now, I don't see declining birth rates as a problem. And I should add, just to sort of declare my own position, if I were, I'm not in my 20s today, but if I were in my 20s looking at the future and thinking about, getting married, procreating, all that stuff, given what I know now, I would not have children. I see the future in such a negative sense at the moment, with the globalists taking control, taking away freedoms, and engaging in censorship, and the media, the torrent of lie upon lie that they tell, and the government behave the lies that the government, they no longer represent the people. All of these things would lead me to take the view that I don't want to have children. I don't want children. I don't want to procreate and give children this future, would be my position. Especially given the hatred of white people in white countries. Again, a coordinated campaign of hatred against white people, white history, white culture, and white accomplishments, and so on. Well, gee, I wouldn't want to give that to children. I take the view that I wouldn't have children so they would look after me when I'm an old, in my old age, which I'm now approaching, of course. I'm 61, for goodness sake. So my view of having children is that I would want to give them at least as good, and my preference be for a better life than I had, and that I would want to be in position to give them every assistance that I could to accomplish that outcome. And if I was in doubt about that, and in such a level of doubt that I personally couldn't influence things sufficiently to ensure that they had a good life, or that the other factors involved, such as hatred of white people and destruction of white history, or white people are Nazis, that sort of thing, I wouldn't want to bequeath that life to them. So I would not have children. I just wouldn't do it, because I would be, in my view, giving them a life, or handing them a life, bequeathing them a life that would be worse than my own, and where their prospects would be quite poor, given again this hatred of white people. So I would take that position and just wouldn't have children. But anyway, coming back to this issue of societal collapse due to population decline. So population decline is I think in Australia at the moment there's something on or about 1.5 births per woman. But if we actually it's a little higher than that. But if we look at that, the overwhelming majority of those births are coming from Islamic and brown people and so on. They're not coming from the white population. So this is contributing very heavily to white replacement. And also the multicultural nature of Australia is meaning that Indians, Chinese, and any other one are not integrating or assimilating. So Indians, a third, fourth generation, fifth, sixth generation Western born are still sending back to the village of their ancestors for husbands and brides. This idea that there's an ever increasing demand for labour, for workers to fill what is presumed to be an ever increasing number of jobs is insanity. That's simply not happening. And that this is a fixed in concrete model going forward. There will always be more jobs, always a demand for more labour. That's absurd. It's insane, I would allege. This idea that more and more workers are needed. With AI and 3D printing and all sorts of different technologies coming in that mean that there's going to be fewer and fewer workers needed. Now, if we look at Britain and elsewhere around the West, Canada and so on, there are millions of people who are on some form of welfare or disability, and also millions of people that are underemployed. If you look at the age of, say, white men over the highly qualified, accomplished, credentialed white men over the age of, say, late 40s, underemployment is by far and away the biggest issue. So something like 50% of the UK's working population is either unemployed or underemployed. And yet there's supposedly a demand for more workers. That's insane. That demand simply isn't there. There is no labour shortage. Now, there's a shortage of people who are prepared to live 20 to a one-bedroom apartment and to work at low-paid jobs. There is a shortage of them, but that's not because there is actually a shortage of workers. It's because decisions have been made by the globalist cabal to have a particular cohort of very, very low-paid jobs. And thus coolies and peasants in the third world are considered as desirable to fill those jobs. But that means that we're no longer looking at a capitalist economy, because in a capitalist economy, if you've got a shortage of workers in a particular area, you just increase the benefits or the pay until you can attract enough workers. But that's not what's happening here. Effectively, workers are being forced to take those jobs and live again a lifestyle and a type of life that Western people aren't used to and haven't been used to for well over 100 years. So this idea that there's a growing number of jobs and more workers, that's simply not true. Again, as I mentioned earlier, if there's a smaller population, then you don't need as many school places, you don't need as many hospital beds, you don't need as many mechanics to fix the cars or any. There is a reduction overall in the number of workers needed as the population declines. So this argument that the population declines and the number of workers needed increases somehow, again, is ridiculous in its very very conceptual nature. Now, the argument is that at current birth rates, and there's some variance here, that in the West, populations will increase by, or decrease rather, by give or take about 30%. Now, you can get bigger outliers, say in South Korea, for example, the births per woman is even lower than the Western average. So the decline in population is again, assuming trends continue, which they may not, population decrease is going to be something like 50%, or close to 50%. And there are other countries like Poland, for example, where the population decline is predicted to be somewhere in the region of 40%. Again, assuming current trends. This is a little bit offset by a number of other factors, particularly in the lower income and middle income countries, which have some offsetting factors, such as infant mortality is falling at it was typically quite high, and it's now, even if infant mortality comes down marginally, that still has quite a quick boost to the population. Similarly, people living longer and being fitter for longer, which means people who would have been, say, retired at 65, and they'd be dead by 68, as it used to be. That they now can keep on working until they're in their 70s. They can keep on working until they're 71, 72, because they're fit enough to do the work, particularly if it's white collar work. Or even if they work part time, 3 or 4 days a week or something like that. So this is very much a changed paradigm. The amount of people over the age of 65 that are still work capable is now quite high. It used to be quite low. It's now quite high. And as in, in Australia, there are over 1 million people over the age of 65 that are still work capable. So this idea of people retiring at 65 and being dead by 68, people are now capable, again, continue working until they're 72. In fact, I was talking to a guy recently who he's a very active guy, and he's up early in the morning doing his stuff, and he's turned 72, and he still looks in pretty decent shape. I mean, you can tell he's an older guy, but he's still in decent shape and working. So these are other factors that would create distortions in the view of civilizational collapse. People being work capable for longer. I remember as a kid that listening to the adults talk, they'd say that Billy Bob down the road's just retired from his job at, I don't know, the factory or wherever, and he's going to be. I will be going to his funeral in a couple of years. They always die a couple of years after them, and sure enough, Billy Bob was dead a couple of years later, and that seemed to be how things were. Maybe it's the idea that they've completely lost their purpose in life when they stop work, or they realise suddenly that their wife only tolerated them, and now they're around the home all the time. They're getting in the way, and she can barely stand beside him. Could be the cumulative effect of all of that. But what is the future like? Is the future one of increasing numbers of jobs? If we look at the idea of the universal basic income, and inherent in that is a sharing of the jobs. So this idea that jobs, the work to be done, will be equally shared around, give or take, so that nobody is working a 40-hour week. Everyone works a 1.5 day a week, or something like that, and gets a universal basic income. On that basis, you could say there'd be an increase in demand for workers, because jobs, any work will be subdivided, then subdivided again, subdivided, which is how they used to do it in the communist societies, the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. When East Germany came back into the West Germany, the West Germans were shocked at the extent, not that it happened, they knew what was going on, but the extent of how unproductive the workers were in East Germany. And East Germany was the most productive in the entire communist world. They were the shining shooting star of productivity in the communist world. And yet the West Germans were shocked at how unproductive they were. This idea that you'd have 10 people in the cleaning up department, but they'd only have one broom. So that broom had to be shared among 10 people, which meant that the sweeping up work was subdivided amongst 10 people, and not that each person was productive in their own right. So if you look at that change to, or possible change to, which will be forced upon us by the globalist cabal, then one could argue that there'd be an increase in number of needed workers given the level of subdivision. This in turn would create a mass of consumer people who must consume from the monopolies and the cartels owned by the globe. So they would still have their capitalist top of the range steaks on the plate Learjet lifestyle, where everyone else would be living as a feudal serf. So given that, you could argue that there'll be a need for more people in a world of completely unproductive, subdivided and subdivided work. Now, similarly, there's a concept that runs around of the cost of being kept alive versus any useful contribution that one may make. So, I mean, I don't want to go all Soylent Green here and, apocalyptic 1960s movies or something, but this idea that someone has a potential value when they're young, and that potential value, as in work and that sort of thing, that potential value decreases. It may not be realizable or actual value, but potential value, and that is cast against or measured against the cost of keeping you alive. But by the time you reach a certain age or state of health or condition, maybe you had a bad, I don't know, fall or something years ago, so you're hobbling around and you just can't do anything productive. But the cost of keeping you alive versus the cost of or the potential value you can deliver to society, or to the work group you're in, or to relative to the universal basic income, whatever it may be, means that when you reach a certain point when you no longer can, where your potential value is less than the actual value of keeping you alive or the goods and services you consume, then will the state take it upon themselves to euthanize you? I don't think we're far away from that, actually. That sounds apocalyptic, but I don't think we're far away from it somehow. It'll be dressed up in some, they'll drag people out. So Billy Bob once used a racist slur word or something, so we have to kill him. I mean, it'll be dressed up in something moral, but that's what they'll do, I'm pretty sure. Now, the underemployment in the West, the underemployment among skilled workers is chronic. I see it all the time wherever I go. So the idea, again, there's a shortage of workers and shortage of skills, is just an outright grotesque untruth that the globalists keep pushing at us through their control of the mainstream media. It's simply not true. Now, similarly, we're looking at a situation, and have been for some years now, and it's getting worse, where in terms of employment and recruitment practices in the West, heavy preference is given to prioritise the least productive workers. So through affirmative action and race gender quotas, the West has flipped from having a preference for the most productive, most capable workers to now having a preference for the least capable, least productive workers, again through affirmative action and DEI. So, and that's intentional. It's not something that's an accidental byproduct of equality or something. That's intentional. So the least productive people, the least capable, the least knowledgeable are the ones that employment is prioritized around that. So we're looking at a situation of declining productivity, which fits rather neatly into the idea of subdividing all work to be done on a universal basic income sort of employment payment concept. No one's actually going to get paid. Everyone just gets their UBI, and then they get allocated a piece of work, which they may or may not do productively or usefully. They could have, like they do universities, college, like they have these work group type things or project groups. You're supposed to work in a project, but inevitably results in the weakest, least capable people in the project group not doing anything, and the most capable people doing all the work. And yet the glory is shared around equally, even though only 1 or 2 people have carried the other 4 or 5 people. And I see universal basic income and work group, work allocation to the group. I see that as following a similar trend. When we look at technological changes, and we see this in Japan with the declining population, the Japanese are looking very much at more efficiencies, greater use of robotics, more emphasis on keeping people fitter for longer. If you live to the age of, for example, if you live to the age of 85 in good health and then suddenly drop dead, that's preferable to spending 10 years withering away like a fucking vegetable, I would think, anyway. So the use of technology and robotization and so on to say to work, help looking after retired elderly people that may be somewhat infirm, for example. Now, the other thing that we haven't really looked at is that how did old people, retirees or people who are infirm, how did they get looked after before welfare, before modern welfare? Well, they got looked after by the family. The family looked after them, and you'd have multiple generations living in a household. That wasn't unusual. In fact, that's how things were done. The idea you'd have one household and you'd the 3 generations, possibly 4 generations would live there. And you see this with the third world people who come to Australia. There are Indian households. It's quite common for them to have 3 or 4 generations in the same household. It's not unusual at all. So you get and you might have cousins, uncles, and aunts, and the whole 9 yards in in one 6-bedroom household, and they go out to work. Anybody who can work works. Then you've got the students doing that. They also would maybe do some part-time work, or the young kids going to school. The grandparents or great grandparents, whatever it might be, there. They all help with looking after the children, picking them up from school, cooking the food, keeping the place functioning and tidy, and I don't know, digging the weeds in the garden and whatever else. They're doing all that sort of stuff, so that the working age people can concentrate on their work, the students can concentrate on their studies, and the food's always there. The shopping, the grocery shopping's always done, and that sort of stuff. So it's, in an overall scheme of things, it's quite an efficient sort of household. And in return, the old people are getting looked after, even though they can't work anymore. And especially in the case of migrants, maybe they don't even speak the language. But they look after the household, and they're as a result, they're kind of taken care of. So when they are infirm, they don't get put in a home or something like that. They get kept in the household and looked after. Their services of the past are recognised as their contribution, if you like, to the overall family and its well-being, and so they're looked after because of that. So there'll be a move back. I think there'll be a move back to particularly the cost of real estate, where it now would take 2 generations to buy a property, 3 generations even to acquire a property and pay it off. So this idea of people being living in a multi-generational household, that would also, I would argue, have the effect of bringing procreation back into focus, where because of this, people would be prepared to procreate because there was so much sort of safety in numbers, if you like, in the wider family. So in summary, I could go on for longer here, but in summary, is a low birth rate today, and that may change. Trends change. Birth rates have gone from being very low to very high in the past, and we'll see it again. But assuming current trends continue for at least the next, say, 50 odd years, then I don't think that it's a bad thing in itself. There'll be many other peripheral and associated and subset changes happening all around that reality, which would cause or would likely produce an outcome that will be nothing like an apocalyptic or societal collapse thing. Sometimes we look back at things like, say Rome, where medieval travelers to Italy, there's some medieval travelers from England were going through Rome, and I've mentioned this in other videos, in the I think it was like the 1300s, somewhere around there, and they'd been reading their histories of Rome. Rome was a city of 1 million people. It was the center of the Mediterranean world, where the decisions affecting the entire Mediterranean were made by all-powerful Roman emperors and senators. The concentration of wealth in one area was the greatest that the Mediterranean basin had ever seen, and yet when these travelers went through Rome, again around 1300s, went through Rome, they were staggered. The population of Rome had gone from 1 million to about 30,000. Just think about that. Everywhere there were buildings that had fallen into disrepair. Goat herders were herding their goats through the Colosseum and what had once been the Senate, and and through the once majestic, all-powerful imperial buildings of imperial Rome were now just lying in ruins, with again goat herders and feral stray cats running around, and there were no people to be seen. these travellers were shocked at what had happened to, and that's a civilizational collapse of epic proportions. And I suppose it's not impossible to conceive that for the West. I don't think that's how it's going to go, but maybe I'm wrong. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback Channel. Thank you for listening.